Rising off the edge of Interstate 15, straight up out of the desert, there is a steel lift hill about 209 feet tall, the tallest thing for miles in any direction. When it opened in 1994, it was billed as the tallest and fastest roller coaster in the world, and it stands right at the line where California becomes Nevada, close enough that the cars underneath it never stop coming. And it is not moving. It has not moved in a long time. Think about what that machine was built to do. The tallest, fastest ride ever made to pull a driver off a highway is now the most visible thing standing over a resort no one can walk into. It still rises over Buffalo Bills today, and Buffalo Bills is closed. Anyone driving north out of California sees it before they see anything else in Nevada. A world record pointed down at a first drop it no longer takes. That is the first thing you see in Primm, Nevada. And for a lot of people now, it is the only thing. This is a story about a stretch of desert bought for about $30 an acre, about a casino empire sold for $400 million and dragged into bankruptcy less than 2 years later, about a shutdown the company called Permanent that lasted 17 days, and about a dead bootlegger who got dug up by the casino named after him. And here's the part the empty parking lot photographs leave out. Nothing ever went wrong with where Primm sat. What changed was the law on the other side of the line. To understand how a place with a world record roller coaster ended up with empty parking lots, the story runs back to before there was a Nevada worth crossing into, to a strip of Mojave dirt, a bootlegger who died in 1933, and a card dealer who bought the whole thing for about $30 an acre. His name was Ernest Primm, and in the early 1950s, he paid $12,000 for roughly 400 acres of Nevada scrub pressed right against the California line. $30 an acre for dirt whose only asset was which side of a surveyor's mark it sat on. There was nothing there. No water worth the name, no shade, no town, no reason on earth for a human being to stop except one. On the California side of that line, a man could not legally place a bet. On the Nevada side, he could. Nevada had made casino gambling legal. California had not and would not for 2 more generations. The highway that carried Southern California toward Las Vegas crossed the boundary at exactly this spot, which meant this patch of Mojave was the first place a driver coming out of Los Angeles could legally gamble without finishing the trip. Primm had dealt cards for a living. He understood precisely what that was worth, and he understood it was worth nothing anywhere else. Think about what the whole place rested on. Not a river, not a mountain pass, not a mine, not a harbor. The reasons most towns exist at all. Primm rested on a decision made in a state house that one side of an invisible line could do a thing the other side could not. Everything that came after was built on that single sentence of law. The thing to understand about Primm is that it was never really about gambling. It was about a line. Move that same 800 acres 50 miles in any direction, and it is worthless desert, indistinguishable from the thousands of square miles of nothing around it. Leave it exactly where it is, half a step inside Nevada, and it becomes the most valuable empty dirt in the Mojave, not because of anything on it, but because of what the law would not allow on the other side of a fence. And there was no competition, because competition was illegal. The nearest legal casino in any other direction was Las Vegas itself, another 40 miles up the same highway. For a Southern California driver who did not want the whole drive, Primm was not the cheap option or the close option. It was the only option, the single legal bet between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, sitting at the first inch of Nevada. That is not a good location. That is a monopoly. And Ernie Primm had quietly bought the ground it stood on. The place already had a name when he bought it. They called it State Line. 2 words, no imagination required, because the state line was the entire reason anyone had ever stopped there at all. Ernie Primm did not stumble onto that. He went looking for a border and bought the ground on the right side of it. Later, the federal government deeded him another 400 acres or so of the surrounding desert, and his holding grew to around 800 acres of sand, straddling the one legal distinction that gave any of it meaning. A word about the man the biggest casino here would eventually carry the name of. Decades before Primm arrived, a bootlegger named Pete McIntyre had run a gas and service stop out at the state line, selling fuel to the few cars braving the desert crossing and selling liquor to whoever wanted it in the years when selling liquor was a federal crime. Everyone called him Whiskey Pete. He worked the same asset Ernie Primm would later buy. The plain fact that this was the spot where travelers stopped, because the desert in both directions left them no other choice. He died in 1933. For a long while, all he left behind was the name. That was what Ernie Primm bought into: a gas stop, a dead man's legend, and a survey line. He did not rush it. Through the 1950s and 60s, the operation stayed small, a place to fuel up, drop a few dollars, and keep driving into Nevada. It was in the mid-1970s that Primm finally built the thing the location had always promised. He put up a small casino and a 12-room motel, planted at the border to catch the cars before they reached anywhere else, and in 1977 it opened under the dead bootlegger's name, Whiskey Pete's, a 12-room motel at a gas stop named for a man who had been dead 44 years. The customers were exactly who the location predicted: not high rollers, not conventioneers, working families and value gamblers driving in from Southern California, hunting for the nearest legal bet and the cheapest bed attached to it. From the first day, that was the whole business model, and it never really changed for the next 50 years. It was the drive and the line at the end of it. Ernie Primm died in 1981, before the border stop became anything like an empire. But he had already done the one thing that would outlast every casino built on top of it. He had bought the ground. As the resorts changed names and changed owners over the decades to come, and they would change often, the land underneath them stayed with his family, leased to the operators, and never sold out from under them. The dirt's only asset was which side of a survey line it sat on. The family that owned the dirt would still own it long after every operator was gone. Here is where a roadside stop decided it was going to be a destination. The work of turning his father's border bet into an institution fell to Gary Primm, and Gary Primm did not think small. In 1990, he opened the Prima Donna, a full resort rising off the desert floor where there had been little more than a motel and a gaming room before. It was the first time the state line offered a reason to stay the night rather than fuel up and drive on. 4 years later, he went much bigger. On the 14th of May, 1994, Gary Primm cut the ribbon on Buffalo Bill's. 592 rooms, built to look like a frontier boomtown, down to the weathered fake storefronts. And behind him, as he did it, the lift hill of the Desperado rose 209 feet into the sky, the tallest and fastest roller coaster on Earth the day it opened, engineered to be seen from the freeway before a single other thing in Nevada came into view. The ride was not really an amusement. It was a billboard drivers could hear from the road. This was not a roadside stop growing up. It was a city being built where no city had any business being. He was not finished. In 1995, a second hotel tower pushed the room count at Buffalo Bill's past 1,200. In 1998, he added a shopping mall, the fashion outlets of Las Vegas, more than 100 stores across roughly 370,000 square feet of retail, dropped into the sand 40 miles short of the city it borrowed its name from. In under a decade, the state line had gone from a gas stop to 3 casinos, a concert arena, an outlet mall, and a world record ride, all facing the same lanes of traffic. The 3 houses were all in place now. Whiskey Pete's from 1977, the Prima Donna from 1990, Buffalo Bill's from 1994, 3 casinos on the same border, selling the same legal bet to the same cars, coming out of the same state that still would not let them do it at home. The monorail came too, and the arena, and parking to hold thousands of cars at once. By the late 1990s, Primm had every piece a Las Vegas resort had, in miniature, in triplicate, sitting 40 miles early on the freeway. The only thing it did not have was a city around it. It did not believe it needed one. And here is a purchase from a few years earlier that comes back before this is over. In 1988, Gary Primm paid $250,000 for an automobile, a bullet-riddled 1934 Ford, and put it behind glass as an attraction. This is the moment to note the car, because a Ford bought for $250,000 matters later, and it matters for exactly the reason everything at Primm mattered. It gave a moving car a reason to stop. Because that was the logic under all of it, the same logic Ernie Primm had bought into back in the 50s. Give the Southern California driver a reason to pull off the highway and pull off here at the line rather than push another 40 minutes onto Las Vegas. The coaster, the towers, the mall, the outlaw's car, the frontier facades, every one of them was a larger version of the same single bet. All of it existed to convert momentum into a stop, and a stop into a night, and a night into a loss at the tables. Had the Primms kept it a gas and slots pull-off, there would be no world record coaster standing over an empty lot today, because there would have been no golden age to end. But they did build it, all of it, right at the border. And for about a decade, the bet paid better than anyone out in that desert had a right to expect. At its height, Primm did not feel like a place travelers were merely passing through. It felt like somewhere that had decided to exist on purpose, out where nothing else had. By the peak, the numbers on the ground were real, and they were large. Buffalo Bill's ran around 1,240 rooms, 62,000 square feet of casino floor, 952 slot machines, and 33 table games. The Primm Valley Resort, the old Prima Donna, renamed, carried better than 620 rooms, some 38,000 square feet of floor, 906 machines, and 28 tables. Whiskey Pete's held close to 780 rooms, another 36,000 square feet, 721 machines, and 13 tables. 3 houses, well over 2,000 rooms between them, more than 2,500 machines, all of it aimed down the same stretch of Interstate 15 at the same headlights. Set those numbers against the fact that no town existed there, and they get stranger still. 2,500 slot machines and better than 2,000 hotel rooms in a place with no residents except the people who worked the floors. Everything at Primm was built at city scale and dropped somewhere no city had ever been. Picture the drive-in from Los Angeles. 3-4 hours of nothing but the Mojave, sliding past the glass, the heat coming off the road in sheets, the last real town an hour back at Baker. And then this, a fake frontier town, a fake mining town, a roller coaster climbing against the sky, all of it lit up at the state line like a mirage that took a traveler's money and handed back a room key. The arena made it stranger and better. 200 miles from the nearest real city, Buffalo Bills booked national headliners into its showroom and, this is the part that should not have worked, filled the seats. Reba McEntire played it. So did Aretha Franklin. So did Snoop Dogg, Johnny Cash, and George Jones, and Patti LaBelle, and Kenny Rogers, and Chubby Checker all worked that desert stage, and so did Tony Tennille and Daryl Dragon, the pair behind the captain and Tennille, all of them, out at the border, to rooms full of people who had driven in from another state to be there. Plenty of casinos booked big acts. Few of them sat 200 miles from a city and filled the seats anyway. The people who kept it running lived the boom from the inside. They are the ones worth naming. Rosa Diaz worked housekeeping, turning rooms over on the full house weekends when every one of those 2,000-odd beds needed stripping and remaking before the next set of California plates rolled in off the freeway. A bartender named John Hayes walked in as a barback in 2004, hauling ice in cases and learning a floor that was still, then, running at full tilt. Holly Vaughn, a small business owner who had been coming out to Primm for years, treated the place the way a lot of Southern Californians did, as the regular stop, the known quantity, the lights people started watching for after the long dark hour past Baker. Joni Tovar and her husband Robert made that same drive in from Southern California, again and again, the way people keep going back to a place until it stops being a trip and becomes a habit. Nobody had to sell Primm to the Tovars. It was simply where they went, the place at the end of the drive, and they would still be saying so decades later, long after almost everyone else had stopped coming. The mall was part of the same pull. The fashion outlets ran better than 100 stores across 370,000 square feet of desert retail, so a family could gamble, sleep, catch a show, and shop the brand name outlets without once getting back on the freeway. That was the whole design. Primm did not want the car stopped for a full tank. It wanted the car stopped for a full day, and at the peak, that is exactly what it got. For the people who worked there, Primm was less a town than a company address in the middle of nowhere. The on-site housing was not a perk. It was a necessity, because the nearest place to actually live was the same hour of empty desert the customers drove to get there. Rosa Diaz and John Hayes and hundreds of others clocked in at a resort with no town attached to it, at the far edge of a state, on the strength of a boundary a surveyor had drawn a century before any of them were born, and here is a number that never made it onto a brochure. The rooms were cheap, and there was no resort fee bolted onto the bill. None of the quiet surcharges the Las Vegas Strip had trained its guests to swallow without looking. Primm undersold Las Vegas on purpose because underselling Las Vegas, one exit into Nevada, was the entire proposition. Cheap rooms, cheap bets, no fee, a coaster the kids could watch from the back seat, and a bullet-riddled Ford behind glass over at Whiskey Pete's. The company even housed some of its own workers on site, out at the line, because there was no town nearby to house them in. They either lived where they worked or drove the same desert their customer did. That was Primm at full volume. The arena loud, the coaster running, the lot packed bumper to bumper with California plates, the buffet lines moving, and a family from Riverside or Temecula deciding that the nearest legal bet was reason enough to leave the freeway. It felt permanent. It was not, but that is exactly what it felt like from inside. And the higher a place stands on a feeling like that, the farther there is to fall the day the feeling turns out to have been rented. A word about the dead man under the property. Whiskey Pete McIntyre had been in the ground more than 40 years by the time the casino carrying his name opened in 1977. He was the bootlegger who had run the gas stop at the state line back when the desert crossing was dangerous enough that a man selling fuel and illegal liquor at the border could make a living off nothing but other people's thirst and other people's fear of running dry between towns. Naming the resort after him was frontier branding. A colorful dead man to sell a colorful stop. That should have been the whole of his part in the story. By the time the resort opened, almost no one crossing the line knew there had ever been a real Whiskey Pete. He had become a logo, a theme, a font on a sign over a casino floor, a dead man rendered down into decor. That is usually where a story like his quietly ends, but the story is stranger than a name on a sign. In 1994, the same year Buffalo Bills and the Desperado opened, the year the whole place went vertical, construction crews working on a monorail meant to connect the Primm properties were digging near the resort when they struck a coffin. Inside, it was Whiskey Pete himself. The casino named for the dead bootlegger had, without meaning to, dug the dead bootlegger back up. There is a piece of folklore fixed to this, and it deserves to be flagged as exactly that, folklore. The tale that circulates is that Pete McIntyre was buried standing upright, a bottle of whiskey in his hands, facing the road he had worked. The exhumation itself is documented. The coffin was real, the remains were his, the reburial happened. The upright with a bottle detail is legend, the kind of story a place like this grows around itself when the plain truth is not quite theatrical enough, and there is no record to confirm it. What is certain is smaller and stranger than the myth. A man who died in 1933 was pulled out of the desert in 1994 by the resort that had turned his name into a marquee and then quietly put back into the ground. The monorail itself shows what Primm had become by 1994, a place big enough to need a train to move guests between its own casinos, 3 resorts, and a mall spread far enough across the sand that walking was never the plan. Digging the footings for that train is what turned up the coffin. The remains were reburied, and the resort went on selling the dead man's name over the grave, exactly as it had from the day the doors opened. There is something almost too neat about the whole thing. The first casino at the line was named for a dead man nobody living had ever met, And then the town that had haunted itself with him, only in name, reached down into the earth and, for a moment, by accident, held the actual man. Ernie Primm had bought the land Pete was lying under. His son, Gary, was building the monorail that found him. And the town had, in a sense, been selling the dead bootlegger the entire time. His name on the biggest early sign, his legend on the walls, his ghost in the brochures, right up until the day it dug him out of the actual ground and had to decide where to put him next. That is the thing about a place whose only product is a reason to stop. A place that sold the act of stopping had been quietly selling a dead man the whole time, and then, without meaning to, it dug him up. Most border stops stay border stops. This one got swallowed by the biggest name in Las Vegas and kept right on growing. In November of 1998, the Primm operation agreed to combine with MGM Grand, the largest company on the Strip, the name behind what was then the biggest hotel in the world. The deal closed on the 1st of March, 1999. MGM took the Primm resorts for roughly $244 million in equity, plus about $315 million in assumed debt, and the package carried something extra. The Primm side's 50% stake in the New York casino back on the Las Vegas Strip. A gas stop at the state line had, in under half a century, become an asset the biggest operator in the business wanted badly enough to pay more than $500 million all in to get. The New York stake shows how far the border stop had traveled. The family that had bought Desert Scrub at $30 an acre now held half of a themed casino on the Las Vegas Strip itself, folded into a deal with the largest name in the business. From a 12-room motel to a piece of the Strip in a single generation, and then handed off all of it in one transaction. To understand the scale of that sale, understand the buyer. MGM Grand was not a regional operator making a regional bet. It ran the Strip's largest properties, and within a few years, it would become the largest casino company in the world. When a company that size pays better than $500 million for a town at a state line in the middle of the Mojave, it is because the town is throwing off real money. In 1999, Primm was. And here is the figure that shows how big it actually got. Counted up a few years on, the Primm district ran to 2,642 hotel rooms, 137,000 square feet of casino floor, 2,816 slot machines, and 93 table games, plus the mall, plus the arena, plus a roller coaster still holding the title it had taken in 1994. Segment operating profit, the earnings the properties threw off before debt and taxes, the closest thing a casino has to a pulse, ran to roughly $16 million a year heading into 2008. That is the healthy number. Remember it because it is the last healthy number in this story. Everything about the place still said permanence. The Desperado still held its record on paper. The mall still ran its 100 stores. The arena still booked its headliners out into the desert, and the 3 casinos between them still counted their rooms in the thousands. On the balance sheet and on the ground, this was a going concern at the very top of its game. That was the peak, and it proved the place could take a punch. Swallowed by the largest company on the Strip, Primm survived the very thing that usually ends a small operator's story. It got bought by a giant and kept running at full scale right through the handoff without missing a night. The town had only just become Primm at all. The old state line was formally renamed Primm in 1996 after the family that had bought the dirt 3 decades earlier and never let go of it. There is an irony folded into that timing, and it is worth holding on to. The town took the family's name in 1996 and lost operating control of the family's casinos by 1999. The peak and the handoff arrived in almost the same breath. The name went up on the property just as the family stepped back from running it, and the largest company in Las Vegas took the wheel of the whole thing. Remember, this is the peak, because everything after it is subtraction. Because something had already begun moving on the far side of the state line, the California side, where every one of those customers actually lived and slept and paid their bills. Destination-scale casinos were about to open over there between Primm and the cars it fed on. The first of them was 2 years away, and it would never have to advertise a single time. It would only have to be closer. On the 7th of March, 2000, while Primm was still adding hotel rooms, millions of Californians walked into voting booths and, without ever driving to Nevada, began changing what Nevada's state line was worth. What they approved that day was Proposition 1A, an amendment to the California Constitution that cleared the way for tribes across the state to run Las Vegas-style casinos under compacts negotiated with the government. It did not touch Primm. It did not lower a single wall or raise a single rent out at the border. On the 7th of March, 2000, it simply made it possible for the one thing Primm had always sold, a legal bet at the end of the drive, to be sold instead at the beginning of it in California by people with every reason on earth to build big. Think about what that means for a place whose only asset was a state line. Primm's location had never actually been a destination advantage. It had been a legal workaround, the nearest permitted substitute for something California forbade its own residents to do. The border was the product, and the moment California let its residents do that thing closer to home, the workaround had nothing left to sell that anyone had to drive for. They built big, and they built fast. In June of 2002, the Pachanga Band opened a $262 million resort in Temecula. In the dead center of the Southern California market Primm had lived off for a generation. Around 85,000 square feet of casino, 2,000 slot machines, 60 card tables, 15 poker tables, and a 522-room hotel. Mark Maccaro, the Pachanga chairman who had been one of the public faces of the Proposition 1A campaign 2 years earlier, now stood in front of a full-scale resort sitting 90 minutes closer to Los Angeles than Primm had ever managed to be. It kept coming, and each one landed on the same freeway. In December of 2004, under Chairman Maurice Lyons, the Morongo Band opened a destination resort at Cabazon, costing something on the order of $250 million, another tower on the California side, on the same Interstate 15, aimed at the same drivers. Barely a month later, in January of 2005, the San Manuel Band opened a new casino complex up in Highland, a property the band would later expand at a cost of $760 million. 3 resorts, 3 tribes, a little over 2 years, every one of them planted on the near side of the drive. Look at what those openings did to the map and do it while remembering where Primm was in those exact years. In 2002, while Pechanga was opening its doors in Temecula, the resort Gary Primm had built was still booking Reba McEntire into its arena and still pouring concrete for new hotel rooms. The tribes in Temecula and Cabazon and Highland were breaking ground on the near side of the drive at the very moment Primm was expanding on the far side of it. The same years, the opposite direction. Every resort that opened in Southern California was one more reason to never make the drive at all. The timing worked against Primm in a way no one had designed. The very years it spent proving it could grow, the new towers, the new rooms, the corporate parent, were the years its customer base was quietly handed a closer place to spend the same money. Growth and obsolescence arrived on the same calendar. None of this was Primm losing a fight. There was no fight. A gambler in Riverside who had once driven 3 hours to the state line could now drive 40 minutes to Pechanga and get the same tables, the same machines, a newer hotel, and the identical legal bet, without ever crossing into Nevada at all. Primm had never sold anything but the crossing, and in June of 2002, California made the crossing optional. The operator's own later filings would put it in language no one could argue with. In documents submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the company wrote that the Primm properties had been negatively affected by increased competition, the flat regulator's phrase for an economy that had been quietly taken apart from 90 minutes away. The sentence named the cause without ever naming what the cause really was, a state line that had stopped being scarce on a market that no longer had to cross it to do the one thing the line had sold. Primm sold Nevada at the end of the drive. Pechanga brought a Nevada-scale resort to the beginning of it, and nothing about where Primm sat had changed. The coaster was the same height it was in 1994. The border was in the same place it had always been. The drive from Los Angeles was the same length it had been since Ernie Primm bought the dirt for $30 an acre. What changed was that the drive no longer led anywhere a Californian could not already reach without leaving home. And everything built at the state line, the towers, the mall, the record-breaking ride, the arena that somehow filled its seats 200 miles from a city, had been raised on an advantage that a single ballot measure passed by people who would never once drive out to see it had already scheduled for demolition. And the timing could not have been worse. On the 1st of November 2006, MGM announced it was getting out of Primm. The buyer was Herbst Gaming, a Nevada operator that had grown up on slot routes and truck stop casinos, exactly the kind of company that understood a highway market. And the price was $400 million. The deal closed on the 10th of April 2007. Ed Herbst signed for the whole package, the 3 casinos and the travel businesses at the line, and he signed for it at almost the precise top of the market. The Herbsts were not outsiders taking a flyer. They were a Nevada gaming family who had built a company on exactly this kind of drive-in, value-first business, and Primm must have looked like the natural capstone, the biggest border stop in the state, throwing off real money, right where their instincts already lived. They paid $400 million for it in the spring of 2007 on the reasonable belief that what had worked for 50 years would keep working. Months later, the market broke. The financial crisis of 2008 came for exactly the money a value casino 200 miles from a city runs on. the discretionary weekend, the tank of gas, the 2 nights a family could talk itself into, and it came for that money fast. A business already being hollowed out from the California side now had the national economy pulled out from under it as well. The one casino market that could least afford a downturn had just been handed the worst one in 80 years. Herbst paid $400 million in April of 2007. Herbst filed for bankruptcy in March of 2009. There's the tease from the top of this story. Paid in full. An empire bought for $400 million, dragged into bankruptcy in under 2 years. In March of 2009, Herbst Gaming entered Chapter 11, the form of bankruptcy that lets a company keep its doors open while it renegotiates what it owes, under a reported agreement covering something like $847 million in debt. Troy Herbst's name was on the filing. Here is what the annual reports show underneath the summary line. In 2009, total revenue at the Primm properties fell by $34.8 million in a single year, with casino revenue alone down almost $14 million, about 12%. The next year it fell again, another $21 million gone. Casino revenue off close to 10%. Hotel occupancy sliding from just under 54% to just over 48%. The operating profit that had run near $16 million heading into 2008 was down to about $7 million by 2010. Every line on the page pointed the same direction, and the direction was down. When the restructuring was finished, the arithmetic was blunt. The old owner's equity was wiped out entirely. More than $1 billion in long-term debt was terminated, and a successor company took the assets in exchange for roughly $350 million in secured claims, a fraction of what Herbst had paid 3 years earlier. A $400 million empire had been written down in cash terms to something closer to $350, and the people who once owned it own nothing. The place kept running the entire time. That is the quiet strangeness of a casino bankruptcy. The lights stay on, the tables stay open, the coaster keeps climbing its lift hill, while upstairs the ownership of all of it moves from the people who bought it to the people who had lent them the money. To a family pulling in off the freeway in 2009, nothing looked any different. Behind the count room, everything had already changed hands. What happened next is what casinos almost always do when the money contracts, and it is almost always the thing that finishes them. The paperwork of survival came first. The reorganization plan was confirmed on the 22nd of January 2010, took effect on the 5th of February, and the successor company was formally organized on the 29th of March. New management arrived with it. Fresh post-bankruptcy appointments went in on the 7th of January 2011, with David Ross taking over the reorganized company. On the 20th of May 2011, Herbst Gaming took a new name and became Affinity Gaming. Same casino, same coaster, same desert, new letterhead. Then Affinity did the thing. Facing a market that kept shrinking, it went looking for cost to cut, and in 2010 alone, it took roughly $20.8 million out of operating expenses, much of it out of food, beverage, and entertainment. That same year, the arena that had filled its seats 200 miles from a city went dark. The buffet lines got shorter, the shows thinned out. The mall that had opened as the Fashion Outlets was rebranded as Prism Outlets, a new name on a building that was already starting to empty. Every one of those cuts made sense on the 2010 balance sheet. Entertainment and food are expensive, and when the crowds shrink, the easiest line to defend is the one drawn through the cost of the show. Nobody is filling anymore. Affinity was not being reckless. It was doing precisely what a company is supposed to do when revenue falls: protect the margin, trim the extras, wait for conditions to improve. They cut the reasons to stop, to save a business that existed, to make people stop. That is the loop Affinity could not climb out of in the years after 2010. And it is worth stating as an inference rather than a fact the company would sign. A place whose entire product was a reason to pull off the freeway responded to falling traffic by removing the reasons to pull off. Fewer shows and shorter buffets saved money on paper. They also made the drive a little less worth making, which thinned the traffic a little further, which called for the next round of cuts. Every rational, defensible decision made the next year's decision harder. Meanwhile, 90 minutes down the interstate, San Manuel was pouring $760 million into an expansion. That is the number that tells the whole story of these years. On the California side of the drive, the competition was spending $750 million to get bigger, newer, and closer to the customer. On the Nevada side, Affinity was spending its energy working out what else it could safely take away. Scott Butera, running Affinity in the later years, presided over a slow, managed contraction. 3 casinos kept alive on a model that a gaming analyst named David McKee, speaking to Nevada Public Radio, would describe without much mercy. The Primm operation, McKee said, had been all but doomed to failure. Not by mismanagement exactly, by arithmetic that a single ballot measure had set running a decade before Affinity ever owned the name. There was no version of cost-cutting that reached the actual problem, because the actual problem was 90 minutes away and getting larger. By 2024, the subtraction had a schedule. On the 19th of July, 2024, the Primm Valley Golf Club closed. In December of 2024, Affinity suspended the casino and hotel at Whiskey Pete's, the oldest of the 3, the first building at the line, the one named for the dead bootlegger, and turned its lights off. In July of 2025, Buffalo Bill's stopped operating the way it always had, its floor emptied and its record-breaking coaster stilled. 3 closures in 12 months, each one taking away another of the reasons the town had ever given anyone to stop. The golf course went in July. Whiskey Pete's went in December. Buffalo Bill stopped the year after. Whiskey Pete's mattered more than the others, if only for the symmetry. The first casino at the line, the 12-room motel that had grown into the whole idea of Primm, named for the bootlegger the town had once literally dug out of the ground. It was the first of the 3 to go dark for good. None of it happened all at once, and that was its own kind of slow. A town does not usually get to watch itself close on a schedule. Primm did, 1 piece a season, each closure a little smaller in the news than the last. The mall told the same story in miniature. Prism Outlets, 370,000 square feet, built for more than 100 stores, was down to essentially 1, a discount shop called Santa Thrift, sitting alone in a concourse designed for a crowd. A retail center the size of a small airport, reduced to a single open door. Then, In the first week of May 2026, Affinity announced it was closing what remained. The plan was to shut the last of the Primm operations on the 4th of July, and the company filed a WARN notice. The federal warning an employer must give in advance of a mass layoff, named for the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, covering 344 workers, 344 people at the far edge of a state told that the town they worked in would go dark on Independence Day. They had names and faces, not just a head count. Megan Miller was one of the employees caught in the May closure, staring at the same notice as everyone else on the property, with the 4th of July circled on it. The crisis climbed out of the casino and into county government. Michael Naft, a Clark County commissioner, was pulled into the scramble over what would become of Primm and the people whose paychecks came from it. For a few weeks in the spring of 2026, the story of Primm was not about a state line or a ballot measure at all. It was about 344 jobs. The math behind the closure was never really in dispute, only whose fault it was and who should absorb it. Everyone agreed the leasehold was losing money. The fight was over the rent and over whether a landlord that had held the ground since the 1950s should be the one to eat the loss to keep 344 people working. Affinity's explanation of why should be attributed to Affinity every single time, because it is one company's account of a commercial dispute rather than an audited finding. By Affinity's telling, reported at the time by Fox 5 Las Vegas, the Primm leasehold had been losing between $10 and $15 million a year, and the landlord, the family that had owned the ground since the 1950s, would not cut the rent to a level Affinity considered survivable. On the 5th of July, 2026, the company reduced it to a single phrase. The economics of the leasehold, Affinity said, were no longer viable. The company called it permanent. Hold that word. Here is where the story loops back on itself. Follow the chain of who owned Primm in order. The Primm family and the prima donna, then MGM, in 1999, then Herbst for $400 million in 2007, then a bankruptcy successor that became Affinity, and then in 2026, an operator called Terribles, which is itself a Herbst family enterprise. The family whose company had bought Primm at the very top and lost it in bankruptcy was coming back to the same corridor under a different name to run the place their earlier company had let go of. And here is the part that makes it a loop rather than a sale. On the 9th of June, 2026, the Primm family announced an operational agreement with Terribles to stop the shutdown. Nevada regulators approved the transition on an expedited basis on the 25th of June. Over the first days of July, Terribles brought the travel operations back. The fuel at the Chevron and the Flying J, the travel store, the lotto counter, the Starbucks. And on the 5th of July, it assumed management of the gaming property itself. The family that owned the dirt had simply chosen a new operator to run the casino sitting on it. The important thing did not change hands because the important thing was the land, and the land had never left the family. The distinction matters, and the Nevada Independent has been careful to draw it, so this should be too. What happened in 2026 was an operational partnership, not a verified outright sale of the ground. The Primm family remained the landowner as it had been the whole time. Every operator in this story leased the right to run a business on that dirt. None of them ever owned the dirt. There is one last turn in the loop, and it is the name. The town had become Primm in 1996, just as the family handed operating control up to MGM, the family name going onto the property at almost the moment the family stepped back from running it. For 30 years, the casinos carried that name while other companies ran them broke and walked away. The name outlasted every operator. So did the family under it. On the 22nd of July, 2026, at noon, the Primm Valley Resort and Casino reopened. 422 machines, 250 rooms, a William Hill sportsbook, no resort fee, and around 300 employees kept on or brought back. Now count the days from the 5th of July takeover to the 22nd of July reopening. 17. The shutdown the company had called permanent lasted 17 days. Standing on the floor that day was Corey Clementson, Ernie Primm's grandson, president of Primm South Real Estate, still holding the land his grandfather had bought for $30 an acre 3/4 of a century earlier. Beside him was Tim Herbst, the Terrible's chief executive, leading his family back to the corridor a Herbst company had once lost. Of the town's prospects, Clementson said the family believed Primm had a bright future. Herbst, for his part, called the reopening, in his own words, a testament to what can be accomplished. Primm never sold gambling, it sold the state line, and a state line is only worth money as long as the law makes people cross it. That is the verdict the whole story bends toward, and the loop is what proves it. Every operator who ran the place was a tenant. MGM rented it. Herbst rented it and went broke. Affinity rented it and walked away, calling it unviable. The one constant across 75 years and 4 operators was the family under the dirt, still there, still choosing who got to try next. The casinos were rented. The desert was inherited. A word about a car. On the 23rd of May, 1934, in Louisiana, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were killed in a Ford. The car itself, the actual bullet-riddled Ford they died in, became a collectible, passed between owners who understood that a machine associated with a famous death carries a strange kind of value. In 1973, a collector named Peter Simon bought it for $175,000. In 1988, Gary Primm bought it from there for $250,000 and put it behind glass at Whiskey Pete's, where it sat for years as one of the odder attractions on the property. It moved around the district over time, and it was still being documented on the floor at Buffalo Bill's as recently as March of 2024. Parker and Barrow had robbed and killed their way across the middle of the country before a posse caught them on a Louisiana road and fired a barrage of rounds into that Ford. Glass, upholstery, and bullet holes. That is what Gary Primm hung $250,000 on in 1988. He was not buying an automobile. He was buying a reason for a driver to slow down. It worked for decades, which is the whole point. The relic did its job long after the casinos around it stopped doing theirs. Where it is now, and whether the public can walk up to it after the 2026 changeover, is not something the record confirms, so it belongs in the past tense, not promised in the present. But the car is not the strange part. The strange part is why Primm needed it. Think about what $250,000 for a dead outlaw's car actually buys. It is not gambling. It is not a hotel room. It is a reason to pull off the highway. The same thing the coaster was, the same thing the frontier facades were, the same thing the dead bootlegger's name over the door had always been. Primm was always selling the act of stopping, and a bullet-riddled Ford is a reason to stop. This is an inference the record supports rather than a claim any brochure made outright. The town needed its myths because a highway exit on its own is not a destination. It has to be built into one, object by object and story by story, until a driver decides the stop is worth making, and the myths outlasted the machine that made them. The outlaw car, bought secondhand for $250,000, proved more durable than the casino economy assembled to display it. A relic of one violent afternoon in 1934, survived MGM, survived Herbst, survived Affinity. The reason to stop outlived the place that needed people to. Picture the bar on the 22nd of July, 2026. Behind it, pouring the first drinks in the relaunched casino, is Hayes, the same man who had walked into Primm as a barback in 2004, hauling ice and cases and learning the floor. He had been there for the entire arc. He worked the golden age when the lot was full of California plates. He worked the 2009 bankruptcy when the ownership changed hands over his head and nothing on the floor looked any different. He worked the long, grinding contraction of the 2010s, the year the arena went dark and the buffet lines shortened around him. 20 years is a long time to stand in one place and watch it empty out. Hayes did it, not as an owner or an executive with a stake in the ending, but as the man who kept showing up to pour drinks whether the room was packed with California plates or nearly empty, whether the name on his paycheck read Herbst, Affinity, or Terribles. He watched Whiskey Pete's close in December of 2024 and Buffalo Bills go quiet in July of 2025. And in May of 2026, he had been one of the 344 names on a notice that said the town was ending on the 4th of July. Then it did not end. About 300 of those workers were kept on or brought back when Terribles reopened the doors, and Hayes was one of them. He had started as a barback in 2004. He was still there. In the room that day were faces he knew. Joni and Robert Tovar had made the drive in from Southern California again. The same drive they had been making for decades. The one nobody had ever needed to sell them. Asked why they had come out for the reopening, Joni Tovar said the simplest true thing anyone says in this whole story. We've been coming here for years. There is no clean last one out in this story because the town never quite died. That is exactly what makes Hayes the one to end on. He is not the ruin. He is the thread that ran through the boom, the bankruptcy, the closures, and the reopening, and came out the other side still pouring. That is the part the empty parking lot photographs never managed to hold. The highway never left. The regulars never entirely stopped coming. The traffic underneath the coaster was never the thing that failed. The law on the other side of the line was. And when the doors finally opened again, the people who had always pulled off the freeway pulled off it once more into a town that was one casino lit and two casinos dark. If you drive north on Interstate 15 today and cross out of California, the first thing you see in Nevada is a roller coaster. Below it, as of August of 2026, Primm Valley is open again. 422 machines, 250 rooms, a William Hill sportsbook, no resort fee. The travel infrastructure runs the way it always did. The fuel at the Chevron and the Flying J, the Whiskey Pete's travel store, the Starbucks. A driver coming out of Los Angeles can still stop here, still gas up, still make a bet at the first inch of Nevada. That part of the original bet, the part that was only ever about the line, still works. What is gone is almost everything else. Not the 100 stores, not the golf course, not the arena, not the lights of Whiskey Pete's or Buffalo Bill's, not the coaster moving. Stand in the parking lot and the arithmetic is visible without a spreadsheet. 2 of the 3 casinos are dark. The arena that once booked Aretha Franklin books nothing. The mall built for 100 storefronts holds 1. The coaster that was the tallest and fastest in the world the year it opened has not carried a rider in a very long time. Buffalo Bill's Casino and the Whiskey Pete's Hotel and Casino sit closed with no reopening announced. The golf club has been shut since the 19th of July, 2024. The mall that once ran more than 100 stores across 370,000 square feet is down to a single discount shop in the concourse. The town is half lit, the fuel and 1 casino alive, the rest of it standing there in the sun behind locked doors. And the coaster still stands, 209 feet of steel over the freeway, the tallest and fastest machine ever built to make a driver pull off a highway, motionless above a Buffalo Bill's that no one can enter. Terribles has said a life safety review would be required before the ride could ever run again. So it holds its place on the skyline exactly as it did at the start. The first thing across the line, the most visible thing for miles, a world record pointed down at a first drop it no longer takes. It was built to be the loudest argument in the desert for pulling off the road. It is now the quietest thing standing at the state line. $30 an acre, $12,000 for the dirt, 800 acres in the end, $400 million for the empire, and $400 million gone, $847 million in debt, $34.8 million lost in a single year, $21 million more the year after, 10 to 15 million bled out every year at the end, 16 million in profit at the peak, about 7 million 4 years later, 90 minutes to a closer bet, 344 notices on the 4th of July, 17 days from permanent to open again, 422 machines, 250 rooms, 1 store in a mall built for 100, 2 casinos still dark, 209 feet of steel over the freeway, 1 family still holding the ground under all of it. 209 feet over the interstate, the coaster still stands, still pointed down at the first drop. The cars have not moved in years. The traffic underneath has not stopped once.